Hello and welcome to another episode of the Burge Report on Rainer on Leadership, your online home for leadership lessons and advice for local church. No, my name is not Jonathan Howe, it's Sam Rainer, although that's how Jonathan used to do the show back in the day, if you remember. It was a long time ago. We do have some new listeners since then, and Jonathan's doing great, so we're happy for him. But who's doing even better? That's Ryan Burge. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, buddy. Appreciate being here.
If you've looked at the title of today's episode, it's kind of like, well, I'm going to listen to that one. You might just be listening through as you're traveling or whatever. We're going to be talking about why everyone is having less sex and what it means for the church. So
good.
I will not ask the personal questions of Ryan, like, hey, can you relate to this research or not? But I might be tempted to. But we will leave certain things unsaid. But what doesn't need to be unsaid is our sponsor, Rooted. Rooted Experience is a wonderful curriculum that can help you create a discipleship culture that connects your people and leads to ongoing life change. Rooted is a proven plan for helping people connect to God, their church, and a purpose. It's proven to be a sustainable way to launch groups. Many people want to launch groups. Rooted is a great way to launch more groups in your church. And it just is going to help you approach discipleship to get people out of their comfort zones. I love this curriculum. It is an excellent curriculum. It's been around for a while now, and they have really done a good job with it. So go to experiencerooted.com/churchanswers, experiencerooted.com/churchanswers. There's the link in the show notes as well. I've got a free resource for you. So even if you just go get the freebie, totally recommend you do that. And check out Rooted. Get the downloadable. They've got a free downloadable, experiencerooted.com/churchanswers. All right. This is your most read research project of the year. Correct. I'm shocked. You research sex, and it's what people read. Please explain, right? Not the birds and the bees. I know the birds and the bees, but please explain your research.
Well, when a man and a woman love each other very much, Sam.
Yeah, I'm well aware.
So I'm a socialist. I think people forget the fact that social scientists are not just interested in just their really narrow niche of things. Obviously my deal is religion, which isn't that much of a niche. It's actually pretty broad, but I'm actually more interested in just how society's changing over time, on a bunch of metrics, right? Whether it be economics, education, politics. And I'm also interested in real behavior. And sex is to me is one of the externalities that use the economics term. One thing happens and then something else downstream changes because of the one thing that's happening. I'm always interested in externalities. Obviously society's radically changed it over the last 30 years or so with the rapid increase of technology. And I wondered, the GSS has been asking people about sex, frequency of sex for a long time now, because it's just a social question to ask. And so I was just poking around with the data one day and I was like, man, there's a lot, people are not having nearly as much sex as what the culture talks about. And I just wanted to try to figure out is sex declining? Who's it declining with and from? And what factors make people be more or less likely to have sex? And the big takeaway, the grand takeaway is almost everyone today is having less sex than the same type of person 30 years ago. So a 40-year-old today is having less sex than a 40-year-old in 1991. A 20-year-old, a 60-year-old is having less sex than someone in 1991. It's really across the board. And for some groups, it's not huge. It's maybe 3 or 4 points less likely to have sex. But for some groups, it's humongous. It's a dramatic. People are not having sex as much now as they were 30 years ago. There's just no other way to look at the data.
And this includes young people, obviously, because I think the tendency is to think that they are more sexually depraved today, and that they're more active in in promiscuity. But while they may be viewing more porn because it's more readily available, and that could be part of it as well,
sure.
The actual activity is declining among young people.
I think I actually was working on a presentation about this just today. I don't think people fully realize how safe Gen Z is. And by safe, I just don't mean sex. I mean drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, not dating, not getting a driver's license, not getting a job. It's they're just incredibly worried about every I think we all look back at like our teen years and go, man, I did a lot of stupid things and I was really stupid, but I'm glad I did them. It's like that learning process, that like Rumspringa, to use an Amish term, right? The coming of age thing is, we go sow our wild oats, we go do stupid things, and then when we become adults, we kind of like settle down because we got it out of our system. It looks like Gen Z is not getting anything out of their system when they're 16, 18, 20, 21 years old. And I think, listen, when I say like, oh, young people are having less premarital sex than young people 30 years ago, people go, good. But I'm like, I don't think you can say it's 100% good, because there's going to be other things that kind of unspool from this over the next 10 or 15 years that are probably not going to be as good as we think they are.
Yeah, it gets back to motivation and the reason why.
Mm-hmm.
It's, of course, we don't want unwanted pregnancies. Of course, we
Yes.
don't want young women put into positions of making difficult choices, and of course, we don't want widespread transmission of sexual diseases. I mean, there's all sorts of like positive
Mm-hmm.
things that are resulting from hey, just young people and people in general are not having as much sex. But why? That's the key question. And it's not because hey, God is holy and this is his design for marriage,
Yes.
and I want to enter into a covenant marriage where I've got a great husband or a great wife, and we're going to just grow old together. We're going to discover everything together on our own. If that were the reason why, that would be a very healthy reason why. But
Yes.
that's not what's happening. I do think that there are some downstream implications of this that we're just not aware of yet. So let's talk about it from the church perspective, like a pastoral perspective.
Yeah.
The first thing is that marriage rates are falling. So, it's not like people are saying, and I understand that purity culture had a lot of negative things around it. I get that, but it's not like people are saying, hey, I'm going to get married. I'm going to get married at 20 years old, and I'm just going to, have a great family. And no, marriage rates are falling. So,
Mm-hmm.
we're seeing less sexual activity as people are getting married less. So that can't be a good thing.
No. And I think the thing is, like, okay, yes, married people have sex, but unmarried people have sex too. Like, the sexual ethic in America is definitely, I wouldn't call it puritanical, about like you have to be married. Very few people, like, besides evangelicalism, there's not a whole lot of Americans who are like, no, premarital sex is bad. Um, I think it's the marriage rate declining. Here's the knock against that, by the way. If you compare married people 30 years ago to married people today, married people 30 years ago were having sex more frequently than married people today are having sex. So it's not like if we all got married at the same rate we did in 1985, that this would all solve. The sex gap would close and we'd all be back to good. Even married people, think about this. Even married people are having sex less today than 30 years ago. So it's not about the you don't want to have sex outside of a wedding, a marriage relationship. That is not what's driving this difference. It's actually probably something a lot more nefarious and a lot more difficult to fix than just, if we increase the marriage rate 7 points, then this will all go away. I do not believe that is true at all. And the data says that, by the way. Married people are having sex less than married people 30 years ago. It's not about marriage.
So this also means that we're starting families later.
Correct.
And that has certain implications as well. So
Yeah.
when children are born to parents who are older, by the way, nothing wrong with that. If
No.
that's your story, I mean, my wife's parents could not have children for a long, long time, and then had her at 38 and her brother at 40. And,
Wow.
they got married when they were like 18 or something, would love to have kids earlier. That's just their story. So
Mm-hmm.
I want everyone to hear, when we talk on the Burge report, we're talking like generalities. We're
Of course.
talking like big picture, social science, demographics. So I don't want anyone to like take personal offense with any of this stuff. So if you happen to start your family later, hey, I hope your family's doing great.
Of course.
I don't have anything personally against that. But when you talk about a trend, like, okay, now this is like everybody, there are implications. So with people starting families later and with couples having fewer children, what's that doing to society?
Well, let me just mention a couple of things. One is that teen pregnancy rates have actually declined dramatically over the last 30 years. Like a teen girl is 1/4 as likely to be a parent today as they were in 1990. Like that's how much teen pregnancy rates have declined, which is listen, we all can say that's a good thing. It's really hard to argue like teen pregnancy is a good thing in America. I know fertility is declining, but the solution is not 17-year-old girls having babies. That ain't how we're going to fix this problem. So let's be clear about that. There's actually some good news in the not having sex thing, and that is fewer teen parents, which is a good thing. I think there's all kinds of knock-on effects, that happen in other parts of American society. And I'll give you an example. Like one thing we know is one of the strongest predictors. And actually, I wrote a post that's going to come on my Substack, probably close to when this is publishing. It's about like what predicts higher church attendance. And we talked about education. Like that's one thing I talk about a lot is education. But here's what's fascinating. If you bifurcate the sample into people who have children and people who don't have children, and like just look at people under the age of 45. So like when you're going to have those kids at home, when you look at someone with a 4-year college degree that has kids, they're 3 times more likely to be in church than someone with a 4-year college degree who does not have children. Just think about that for a second. Having children makes you at least 2 to 3 times more likely to be in church than not having children does. And you got to think, okay, so why is that? Now, from a pure social science perspective, there's a latent variable here, which is partisanship. We know that liberals have fewer children, have children later, don't have children at near the rate that conservatives do. We also know that those things are related to going to church because conservatives are more likely to go to church than liberals are. But to me, that can't explain all of it. There's got to be something else beyond just partisanship and ideology. I think it's the idea of like there's a traditional way to go through life, right? Which is like get a degree, get a good job, get married, have children. You've done everything right. So going to church is also the right thing to do, quote unquote. I think churches really need to think about like, how do you reach out to people who are 35, make a good income, have a good education, but don't have any children or are unmarried? Why are they feeling so left out and like they don't belong in a religious context? And how can churches like create a welcome and say, we're just glad you're here. I don't care if you're married, divorced, widowed, got 2 kids, got no kids, got step kids. We don't care. I think that's the problem is the prevailing culture is you don't go to church unless you check all the I did things right boxes in life. And I think that's a real problem because listen, who needs help from the church the most? Single mothers, widows, people who don't, fall in the traditional boxes. And I think that's a real failing of the church in some ways that they've not been, generally speaking, more intentional about reaching out to those groups. Because the data says, by the way, those groups are growing. Childless 35-year-olds are growing. Both men and women are unmarried 35-year-olds are growing. They're falling away from religion too, which, by the way, might make it harder for them to find a spouse and then have children because church is a great way to meet people. So there's a huge societal benefit here outside of just the religious benefit that we always talk about.
So about, I do a lot of demographic reports, and 30 to 40% of households in most communities, households with children, are single parent homes. This is a huge swath of the population when it comes to, hey, there's a household with a child in it. It is, 1 out of 3, 1 out of 4, 1 out of 2 sometimes in a single parent home. I'd also, just as a point of curiosity, I'm well aware of birth rates and things like that, and conservatives and liberals, and you're spot on there. But here's my question for you: at what point do conservatives take over the world because they've had more babies?
Well, you've got to assume though that those conservative kids raised in conservative households don't leave conservatism as they age, which I think actually becomes more problematic as conservatism becomes like a whole ethos and becomes like a majority opinion. Because what kids love to do is reject and rebel against what their parents were. So I don't think it's a one-to-one replacement, but I do think there are parts of the world where this is going to be a real problem. Going forward is like liberals are going to be out, not to get eugenicists or anything like that, but like they're going to be outbred. Like there's just going to be more conservatives because conservatives have more kids. But I don't, the fertility thing is a real problem. And I think the problem with the fertility thing is only conservatives talk about it as it being a problem. It's happening all across the advanced civilizations of the world. It's not just the United States. It's Western Europe. It's Southeast Asia. We're seeing fertility rates in Africa drop in half in one generation because of things like condoms and birth control. I mean, this, there was like this Malthusian idea a long time ago that we're going to have like a population bomb where there's going to be so many people on Earth that we couldn't support them through agriculture or anything else, and they were going to just die off. And guess what? That will never, ever happen. Because the thing that the Malthusians did not understand was fertility is not going to continue to rise, logarithmically. It's actually going to plateau. And the United Nations says we might hit peak population in the next 50 years because the fertility rate is dropping. So why is that a problem? Here's a huge problem. Who's going to pay our Social Security and Medicare for the baby boomers and Gen X when there's fewer and fewer babies being born in America to come into the workforce? This is a real like mathematical problem. It's a societal problem too. And I think the church could play a role in at least encouraging people to get married and have kids. I know that sounds crazy, but like, you know what the number one reason why people vote is, Sam?
The future of their children.
Because they were asked to vote.
That's literally. I was just guessing.
Yeah, I know, but like there's this whole book I read by Rosenstone and Hansen in grad school about like why people vote, and like you could like distill it into one paragraph, and it's like if you ask someone to vote, they're more likely to vote. Like that's really a simple. So you know what pastors need to think about that? People are more likely to get married if they're encouraged to marry. They're more likely to have children if they're encouraged to have children. And I think the difference for a lot of people is not having between 0 and 1 children. It's having like, I have 2. Should I have more? Well, man, like, a lot of the families in the church have 3 kids, and the pastor is talking to me how it's good to have kids. So I might have an additional child. Little stuff like that can actually, at the aggregate level, have a huge difference on the future of our country, really.
Yeah, great points, Ryan. As a reminder, the eugenics movement of the early 1900s was a progressive liberal movement, not a conservative movement. So the liberals have always pushed back hard against population increases for various reasons. Conservatives seem to be the ones that want things to grow, including families. And I know that is a very general statement. I'm painting with broad strokes, but if you are not familiar with the eugenics movement, particularly in the U.S. of the 1920s, you should really study that because it is a forgotten part of our history and a very tragic part of our history, unfortunately. The other thing that I want to point out is often I think pastors like myself who we bristle just a little bit at the idea of like encouraging all of your families just to have babies. Yeah. Because one, that's an individual decision that those families need to make. So let's recognize that. And I know you believe that.
Correct.
Like, of
Absolutely.
course,
yes.
A mom and a dad having children, they need to make that decision. 2, 3, 4, 5. Do we adopt? Do we foster? Those are all decisions that the family needs to make. And that is the family's decision alone. So sometimes I feel like pastors like me don't go there because of fear of like, well, people are going to be offended by this. And there's also kind of a subset of conservative evangelicalism, maybe even beyond evangelicalism, like kind of on the extremes of like literally what I was joking about earlier. If we just all have a bunch of babies, we'll take over the world sort of language. And I don't think that that's all that helpful either, because having babies for political motives is a very strange thing to be doing. But the truth is, our birth rates are right at or below the replacement rate in our culture right now. And if we don't get birth rates back up somehow, some way, or increase immigration by significant standards, we're going to be in a world of hurt economically in 10, 20 years.
And the Cato Institute, which is like a libertarian think tank, basically made that point. If you want GDP to grow year over year, there's only 2 ways to do it in America: dramatically increase fertility or dramatically increase immigration. Those are your only 2 options to get. And that's a conservative organization, by the way. Like, but here's the other thing, Sam. There's so many nations that are struggling with the same birth rate problem that we're struggling with, and they've tried all these interventions, like policy interventions, like we'll cut your taxes. Like in Hungary, if a woman has 4 children, she never pays taxes for the rest of her life. Like that's their incentive to have at least 4 children. What in South Korea and Japan?
That's my family. So Trump administration 4. We're at 4. So
it won't apply retroactively, dude. You already did it. You did it with no incentives. We're not going to incentivize you. In South Korea, they made like daycare free, from birth on, so that women can go back in the workforce. it's not had a demonstrable impact on fertility rates. So it's about culture. Like, I really do think that birth rates, by and large, you tweak on the edges with policy, sure, but you're going to increase your birth rate by 2 points. Culture is what would increase your birth rate by significant amounts. And listen, from a pastoral perspective, I think here's what pastors need to do. You don't need to like get up there on Sunday morning and say, if you don't have 5 kids, you're not doing the will of God. That's nonsense. What you do need to say though is, my children have been a blessing in my life, and one of the greatest things that I've ever done. And I'm so glad that we had another child. Speak from your own personal well of experience, because here's what I've realized about non-parents, people who have never had kids. They only hear the worst parts about being a parent, about the kid puking all over the floor, or you were up all night with a sick child, or you had to buy a van because you have so many kids. Like, all these people know what that feels like. They can conceptualize that in their mind. But what non-parents have a little bit harder time doing is understanding the joy that you get from being a parent. And just making that plain, that like there's so many good, yes, there's the puke on the floor, and that is not fun. But man, to see your son do kindness to other people is one of the greatest feelings on this planet. And just like talking about parenting in a positive, encouraging way is about all you need to do, I think, for a lot of young people to, change their minds about things. Be a positive influence. Tell them the whole story, because I think they're only getting, part of the story on social media or their friends. To me, that's as best as you can do.
So my oldest daughter is in ninth grade,
Mm-hmm.
and it is so much fun watching her play basketball because I played basketball. And she has come to the realization that a lot of today's music sucks. So I introduced her to some 90s grunge, and she has fully embraced the 90s grunge music. And I could not be prouder as a dad. So if you want the things that you enjoy to continue in this world, like 90s grunge, you had better have children and
Mm-hmm.
introduce them to things like good music. Because I'm going to eventually be an old man ranting and raving, right? But that era will continue with my children.
Yeah.
Um, so here's one practical implication of this in the church. Biological growth is not likely, and not as likely as it was in the past. Like,
Mm-hmm.
churches grew in part because people were having more children, and
Yeah.
instead of coming in ones and twos in cars, they were coming in fours and fives into the parking lot. If you're wondering why today's parking lots have to be built with more spaces in churches than in the past, it's because of that reason. Families had one car, they all came to church together, and there was a boatload, that was literally a boatload of them. I know when we go places, we have 4 kids. Now, I grew up in a world where large families were, I knew of large families. So it's not strange to me. I had 3 kids in my family. My mom and dad had 3 boys. So when we go with 4, it's not even in my brain, but we have people all the time commenting on how big my family is. And I'm like, there's 6 of us. Like, it's not that big.
You're not the Duggars. This isn't 19
I
kids and counting,
know.
okay?
I
Like,
know.
let's
I
be
know.
clear.
But my point is that you as a church can't rely on biological growth as much in the past. It's just not there in the data. Or if you are a younger church, like my church is, West Bradenton, 30% of our church is 18 and under. We have a lot of large families. So, we actually are now drawing in larger families because we have families at our church that like
Mm-hmm.
get it. Like,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, your 6 or 7 children, we understand why the youngest does that, because the youngest is in a family of 7, right? So of
Mm-hmm.
course the youngest does that, because I've got a bunch of kids too. Whereas in a church that has almost no kids, you can almost feel that tension. There's really only 2 kinds of restaurants, Ryan: those that embrace children and those that tolerate children.
Yes.
And we know which restaurant, my family knows which restaurant is only tolerating us. There's only 2 kinds of churches: churches that embrace children or churches that tolerate children. And the families feel that.
Oh, yeah.
And so if you want to really see your church grow, you're going to have to encourage more biological growth. And I know that feels weird and it perhaps even a little icky, but it is something. I agree with you. I think pastors need to be speaking into this more.
The data is so, like, conversion is really hard. Like, I use the Latter-day Saints as an example because they're very intentional about missionary activity and evangelism activities. They, every boy is supposed to go on a 2-year mission somewhere in the world and try to evangelize basically 40 hours a week for 2 years. The average missionary gets between 1 and 2 converts their entire mission. So you spend 2 years, 40 hours a week, and you might yield 1 or 2 people. Think about that for a second. You know what's a lot easier? Just having families come to your church who have 4 kids and keep them. Now, that's the key. Keep them. You got to retain them in the church. If they're a leaky boat, that's a real problem because you're just treading water there. But you got to think about, like, every church has this mathematical problem, which is for every funeral, there needs to be a new person added in one way, shape, or form, whether it be a conversion or a new baby born or something like that. That, by the way, that's not to grow. That's just to hold steady. So, like, if the pastor does his little annual report, he's like, I did 37 funerals last year. Your first question should be, how many new members did we add, or how many babies were added to the nursery? Because if it's not 37, you're headed in the wrong direction. So having kids and retaining kids from a pure mathematical equation is the best way to maintain your church or grow your church going forward. You cannot rely on conversion. To me, that's fool's gold, especially in this culture. There's just not, first off, people are not evangelizing very much because they're uncomfortable doing it. And secondly, it's not that effective. And the data says that over and over again. It's just not that effective in a broad sweep to bring lots of people to church.
Now, from a spiritual standpoint, the Holy Spirit can still work. Just
Absolutely.
as a reminder, I know you can't model revival, as you
That's
say,
exactly
but
right.
you're only talking about the data. Last question, last kind of minute here. Are smartphones to blame for this? Is it pornography? Is it people being so distracted by these devices that that they're just not having sex? Is that the issue?
I think it has to be phones. I really do. Like, at the end, and this is impossible to measure because we all have phones now, so there's no like control group that we can, like, hold against the treatment group of who got phones. But we all have to admit that, like, people for millennia in the world had sex because they were bored. Like, let's just like get it right down to it. When you didn't have a TV and you didn't have a radio, and all you did was read books all day and like do chores and work and stuff. When you got home, you got bored, and when you got bored, you want to entertain yourself, and sex is a way to entertain yourself. Like that. At the end of the day, let's get real basic about this life. Now, it's easier to entertain ourselves than ever before. So, sex becomes like an elective thing, not like, well, we got to entertain ourselves. I really do think that it's having a deleterious effect on our attention spans, but also on like all these other things, like the externalities I was talking about. This is the downstream effect. I don't think Mark Zuckerberg ever thought when he invented Facebook that he was going to like lead to people having less sex. But I think there's no other way to look at this, and that it's leading people to have. And again, to go back to what I said 15 minutes ago, it's also married people too. So it's not, you cannot just say it's about like, oh, the youths and all. No. I think married people are on their phones at night. They're texting, they're Facebook scrolling, and they're not, going to have sex with their partner because it's just easier to do those things than it is to do the other thing. And again, there's no solution to this problem. Not that I can come up with, and not one that's readily available to us, unless you're intentional about saying we're going to put the phones down, which I don't know any family that's done that effectively. Maybe it'll happen. Maybe the pendulum swings the other way, but I see no evidence right now that that's going to happen.
So, listeners, those of you who are married, put your phone down tonight. Romance your spouse. That's my pastoral advice. And be more intentional about that. And you also need to be intentional about contacting Upward. That's a really bad segue, but it's all that I have given the subject matter of today's episode.
Well done, Sam. Yes.
Yeah. So Upward, that's not the name. Upward has a new running app. This thing is amazing. A lot of you need more exercise. A lot of you need to make better connections. A lot of you would like to do this through the church. Well, there's several options for you. You can offer a 5K challenge. Upward Running does that. They've got this Run Club app, which is really awesome. It's got tracking and community building built into it. And it's very simple to start. You don't even need a facility. So here's the good thing about this particular Upward program. I mean, basketball is great. They do basketball really, really well. But you kind of need access to a gym. I mean, I have to have a gym, but you need access to a gym. With this, I mean, you can just, if you've got a church parking lot, if you've got a little patch of grass, you can launch a program. There is zero excuse. So, hey, get this going, get your people healthier, both spiritually and physically, build stronger connections. We've been talking about social capital with Ryan Burge. This is a great way to do it. Go to upward.org/run coach, upward.org/run coach. Get started today. Link in the show notes. I'm highly recommending this program, and I think it's phenomenal. Upward does everything well, but this is one you need to check out. Upward.org/run coach. Thank you for tuning in to today's very awkward episode of Rainer on Leadership. We'll have a less awkward episode coming up soon. We'll see you then.